Well, hello there again, and welcome back to GB 102 Bible Backgrounds. In this module, we will be discussing the land of Mesopotamia, and we will discuss the multicultural nature of this land, as it is home to many people, including the Sumerians, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Acadians, the Babylonians, and, well, many other people. Then we will discuss the geography of this place, identifying it uniquely as a land in between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. Finally, we will conclude with a discussion of Mesopotamian culture and how many ideas that originated in this land are also recorded in the biblical text. So, if you're ready, let's buckle down and let's go exploring. Now, the name Mesopotamia applies to a nearly 1,000-mile-long stretch of land that lies in between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. The term Mesopotamia itself comes from two Greek words, mesos, meaning between, and potamos, meaning river. And it's an apt description because without these rivers, the people who lived in Mesopotamia would never have forged the sophisticated culture that they did. You see, Mesopotamia, unlike the Levant, the promised land where God's chosen people, the Israelites, lived, Mesopotamia lies in between two great rivers, and it receives very little to no rainwater every year. And so the major cities in this land will be built along the riverbanks. Life will be sustained by irrigating the plain and the river water, and when the river floods, at least, the soils will become fertile, and the silts and alluvial deposits that are left behind will help in this process. Now, in the Bible, this place often has another name. It's often called the land of Shinar. See Genesis 11, verse 2 for more on that. So, in our lecture last week, we discussed that the Israelite people were surrounded by aggressive foreign nations. In particular, we noted that the world superpowers were Egypt, and then the people from Mesopotamia taken collectively. Well, we need to define that a little bit further now, because Mesopotamia, unlike Egypt, is not a single country. It's made up of more than just a single group of people. In fact, dozens of different people groups will claim this land for the nearly 30 centuries of its continuous habitation. And the one consistent thing about this place will be that the rivers give a substantial advantage to the people who live here. And specifically, they give an advantage over the cultures who are sustained by rainfall alone. They can support larger populations. They can support larger armies. They can support greater trade and other movement of resources simply because they have the rivers. And so, let's talk modern boundaries here for a second. With regards to modern country boundaries, the land of Mesopotamia today includes the countries of Iraq, eastern Syria, and southeastern Turkey. And this is a fairly large area. It's about the size of the state of Texas, at least total square mileage. Well, I guess it wouldn't be a Bible background class if we didn't bring up problems. And today we want to talk about a problem of scope. That Mesopotamia offers us a particular challenge that there's just so much data that we could be sifting through. From the birth of Mesopotamian civilizations all the way down to the time of the birth of Jesus is roughly about 3,100 years. So get that, 3,100 years. And that's a lot of history to cover. In fact, we could probably make a dozen full-length 3-credit-hour classes devoted just to Mesopotamian history, and we probably still would just be scratching the surface here. So, in this lecture, we're going to need to be quite choosy when it comes to what we will discuss and the kinds of people and artifacts we will discuss. So, since other classes here at Mid-Atlantic Christian focus on Mesopotamia, specifically Western Civilization 1 and early Hebrew history or Old Testament history, we will cover different materials than they will discuss in those classes. In this class, we will discuss two primary aspects: the geography of Mesopotamia and the cultural issues that come from Mesopotamia that directly intersect with parts of the biblical text. So, go ahead and pause the video and download the map entitled Mesopotamia Thumbnail. And take a moment to view the timeline entitled Mesopotamian History. This will give you a rough synopsis of what we'll be talking about here over the next 20 to 30 minutes. And it will also give you a pretty good idea of just how much ground we're going to need to cover in this short time we have together for this class. So, as we did last week, I'll cue up the theme music while you go get your map.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map. I'm the map, I'm the map. If there's a place you gotta get, I can get you there, I bet. I'm the map. I'm the map, 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 I'm the map!
Oh goodness, that song is just a gift that keeps on giving. Oh well. So now that you've got your map downloaded and printed out, let's get out our handy markers and crayons and let's start putting some names on these places. First off, though, I want you to notice the scale of this map. It's down in the lower center part of the map. This is a scale bar, and note that 200 miles on this map is a relatively short distance compared to other maps we've looked at so far. Now, to show that, look to the west end of the map. You may notice that there's a couple of 100-mile long squiggles over there. That area over there is the Levant. Pretty small, ain't it? So keep that in mind when you compare the land of Israel to Mesopotamia. That Mesopotamia is huge. It's easily 800 miles to 1,000 miles long, and you can fit quite a lot of people in that space, especially since Mesopotamia is a fertile plain and we're able to produce a lot of food to feed a lot of people in that space. So let's start off marking this map by marking the 5 large bodies of water that appear on this map. On the western edge of the map, there's a large body of water that you're already familiar with. It's the Mediterranean Sea. Go ahead and mark that in blue as we've shown here, and notice that it's a lot smaller on this scale than other maps that we've seen. Now, to the north of that, and along the upper northern and western border of the map, we find an area known as the Black Sea. Heading east from that, we see a large blue fist-like water mass punching its way downward. That's the Caspian Sea. And then to the southeast edge of the map, we see another body of water known as the Persian Gulf. And then finally, below the Mediterranean Sea on the southwest side of the map, we find what's known as the Red Sea. Also notice now that we have a few smaller blue areas on this map that are marked as well. On the west side of the map, those tiny set of squiggles that I alluded to earlier, well, that upper circle represents the Sea of Galilee, while the slightly larger oval circle is the Dead Sea. And now finally notice that west of the Caspian Sea, we will see 2 large lakes. Lake Van is the westernmost lake, and Lake Urmia is the closest lake to the Caspian Sea. So go ahead and pause your video now and label the areas just as I've done here. Okay, so now that you've got that, let's shift some gears here and let's mark some rivers. Now, arguably the most important river to the Mesopotamian plain is the mighty Euphrates River, and I've marked it here in blue. It connects with the Persian Gulf and it carries water all the way down from the Urartu Mountains in what is now modern-day Turkey. So go ahead and mark this river in blue as I've shown you here. And next we have the Tigris River. Now today, this river connects with the Euphrates to form a massive super river that drains into the Persian Gulf. But in the times of antiquity in the ancient Near East, some scholars suggest that these 2 rivers did not connect and instead drained into the Persian Gulf separately. So keep that in mind if you're reading through a Bible atlas or two and some of their pictures of Mesopotamia do not show the 2 rivers connecting. That is simply trying to reflect what some scholars believe was true in the old times here. So go ahead and pause again and mark the Tigris River on your map as we've shown here. Now, you may have already been noticing as you mark the Tigris and Euphrates that we have a few other smaller squiggles or rivers that are feeding into the northern areas of these two massive rivers. And they will be very important to our study here as well. And so the first of these rivers that I want you to note is known as the Lower Zab River. Some scholars have often called it the Lesser Zab River because it is smaller and further south than its twin to the north. So go ahead and pause your video and mark your map and mark this one as the Lower Zab. And speaking of that twin, to the north we have the Upper Zab or the Greater Zab River. Now, several large cities of an ancient people known as the Assyrians will be founded on the banks of these two tributary rivers. They are known collectively as Ashur and Nineveh. And so go ahead and pause the video here and color those two rivers in, my friends. So now, moving on to the west side of the map, let's look at the river here that's marked that looks like the letter T that's draining into the Euphrates River. That river is the Habur River, and it will play a significant role in 2 Kings 17, because when the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed, the people will be deported to a city that is along the banks of this river. Now, to the west of the Habur River, we have the Balik River. Now, these rivers collectively, the Zab, upper and lower, the Habur, the Balik, the Euphrates, the Tigris, all of these rivers will form what is known as the hydrological complex that nourishes and sustains the lower plains of Mesopotamia. I'd also like to add a word of caution when it comes to looking up many of these rivers in your Bible atlases. Simply put, there's no agreed upon way to spell some of these place names in English. For example, in Barry Beitzel's 2009 Bible Atlas, he spells the Balik River, B-A-L-I-K, and he spells it with an H rather than a K as I have it here. So his version says B-A-L-I-H, Baalha River. So just keep this in mind that some of these names will get a little, well, let's call it wonky when you try to look them up. And the reason for this is because they are transliterated terms. Someone has taken the way that they could have sounded in Semitic languages and tried to put them into English. And this is not necessarily an exact science. Semitic languages just simply have some sounds you don't have in English. And some people substitute different letters depending on what you do with those sounds. Now, don't panic though. The good news is that I will not hold you accountable on your tests for exact spelling. The bad news is, though, that you may have to guess at the spelling used in certain books, and you will have to just simply know that certain atlases, certain Bible dictionaries use one spelling and not another. Okay, so now that we've looked at all the water, let's go on and define the three principal mountain ranges on this map. So go ahead and get out a different color so that we can distinguish the mountains from the rivers and other large bodies of water. And these mountains will be important for our study because they served as natural barriers, prohibiting people native to Mesopotamia from branching out easily and conquering people and conquering territory beyond the plains of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, the first mountain chain in this complex I want to discuss is on the northwest side of the map, and it's known as the Taurus Mountains. Now, this is a long chain that separated Mesopotamia from a people known as the Hittites. At least their traditional land was in this area west and north of the Taurus Mountains. So go ahead and pause your video here and mark the map as I've got shown. So then the next mountain range forms a barrier between Mesopotamia and the Black and Caspian Seas, and it's known as the Urartu Mountains. Now, the water that comes off of these mountains, either in the form of melted snow or in direct rainfall, forms that major hydrological system that nourishes the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, as well as the two main lakes, Lake Van and Lake Urmia. So, if you want to know why there's so much water here, it's because of the Urartu Mountains. Now, this mountain chain formed a barrier between the Mesopotamians, and particularly the Assyrians, from a fierce northern tribal group that often was referred to as the Munda, or by the New Testament time they would be called the Scythians in our scriptures. And these people, whose name simply means the hordes, were pretty barbaric and migratory, and often without warning they would invade an area in northern Mesopotamia and just cripple cities and then leave. And so living under the shadow of these mountains and the threat of the Munda proved to be a interesting experience. And as we'll see, many groups like the Assyrians will become pretty battle-hardened by the experience and will, in their own way, become very deadly menaces once they establish their own empire. Now, the last set of mountains we need to look at will be known as the Zagros Mountains. Now, this is an imposing chain of mountains. I mean, we're talking as tall as anything in the Rocky Mountains that we have here in the United States. And this chain of mountains separated two people groups, known as the Medes and the Persians, from the Mesopotamians living on the flat plains of Shinar down below the mountains. And so, go ahead and pause the video and make sure that you have all three of these, the Taurus, the Urartu, and the Zagros Mountains, as I've got marked here. And also note how these mountains, once you have all three on your map, will form a crescent shape. Now, think back to your high school days for a second, or maybe from your time spent in Western Civilization 1, and you may recall that this land is sometimes called the Fertile Crescent. And the reason for this is largely based on geography. These three mountain ranges produce the water necessary to fuel the rivers that basically made Mesopotamia an inhabitable place, but they also formed a barrier to travel and agricultural expansion. And so that crescent shape of the mountains will largely form the crescent shape of places where people will settle in Mesopotamia and the Levant. So now let's shift gears once again and go from talking about the water and mountains to the people groups. And as I said at the start of this lecture, many different people groups will attempt to control this land. And they will be particularly successful in some areas, and in other areas they'll have more difficulty. So on our map, we will want to establish what I'll call a homeland for various people groups. But keep in mind that this does not mean that these people groups didn't move to other areas or didn't try to control other areas. This will only show the place where they had the most influence or where they would have considered their own homeland. And part of the biblical reason that this area is cosmopolitan, that it has so many people groups coming in and out, we can find the reason for this in Genesis chapter 11. In this account, God confuses the language of the people living on the plains of Shinar, and as a result, they will begin to spread out across the known world. And with this in mind, notice that most of these people groups will have a unique language, that the Assyrians and the Sumerians, for example, will have a very different language and even different alphabets. But they will share quite a few customs and traditions. So, in short, they will be culturally similar when compared to groups like, say, the Chinese or the Egyptians, but they will also have some different and significantly different things telling them apart. And they will be distinct enough from one another that we must talk about them separately here for this lecture. So, the first of these early people groups we want to look at is known as the Sumerians. This group flourished in the southern end of Mesopotamia between the years of 3100 BC and 2400 BC. And they'll make a small, quick revival between 2200 BC and 2000 BC. And the Sumerians will largely be responsible for building large cities in southern Mesopotamia. And the three big ones they will make are Ur, spelled U-R, Nippur, and Babylon. And go ahead and mark your map as I've done here. So pause this lecture, mark these three cities, and mark the area of Sumer in green or another color that is pleasing to you here. So you got that? Now, of all these cities of Sumer, the most important for the early biblical text of Genesis is going to be the city of Ur, because this is where the patriarch Abraham lived. Quote, Terah and his son Abraham and his grandson Lot, the sons of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, and his sons Abraham, who was his son Abraham's wife, they all set out from this place called Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. When they came to Haran, they settled there. And so, unquote. So that was from Genesis chapter 11. And what this means is that Abraham began his life journey in one of the largest and oldest cities of the world at the time. And it was certainly one of the most prestigious cities to live in, as the Ur III dynasty, which really kind of picked back up around 2200 BC, represented a brief return to Mesopotamian supremacy for the Sumerians. So, one of the lasting legacies of the Sumerians that I would like for you to understand is that the Sumerians will articulate a worldview of how the universe was shaped. Often when you think about such a worldview, you would call this a cosmology. And that worldview or cosmology will be shared by all of the people in the ancient Near East, including God's chosen people, the Israelites. Now, this worldview can be seen expressed in dozens of passages, but I will give you just a few that your textbook specifically singles out. For example, Walton singles out Genesis 1 through 5, Exodus 24:10, Isaiah 40:22, Ezekiel 1:22, Job 9:6 through 7, Job 22:14, Job 26:10, Job 36:27, Job 38:4 through 6, Job 38:10, Job 38:19, Job 38:22, Psalm 8:3, Psalm 24:2, Psalm 104:3, Psalm 104:9, Proverbs 3:9 through 20, and Proverbs 8:27. Whew. Note from these passages, though, that the Hebrew world is divided into three tiers. There's Sheol, or Sheol, the land of the dead. There's the Aretz, or the land, which is a flat disk. And then there's the firmament, which is described as a solid mass that holds up the moon, the sun, the stars, and it separates the ocean above from the waters below. Now, for some of you, this may be a difficult idea for you to assimilate because you're used to reading a lot of these passages metaphorically, or at least I assume you are. For example, you, as a student living in the 21st century, know that there is no solid mass called a firmament that prevents an ocean of water from falling down on the earth. Today, we understand that the sky is pretty much a very thin layer of gas, and that above that there is a vacuum that we call outer space. You would also probably believe that the sun is not part of the sky itself, but is in fact 93 million miles away. And why I'm telling you all this is that I would like to suggest that to dismiss these passages as a metaphor, to basically say that the ancient authors of the Bible knew better, but were only talking poetically. This is an idea that's known as concordanism, and it misses the point that every culture in the ancient Near East actually believed that this was how the world was shaped. And because of this, I tend to prefer a different interpretation that takes this ancient Near Eastern witness seriously. I believe God purposely used the worldview of these ancient people so that he could communicate his message without confusing them. Now, granted, God could have surely revealed to his people all of the minutiae of astrophysics, quantum mechanics, and a whole host of other scientific discoveries that we don't even know about even today. This, however, would have confused the daylights out of the original audience, and if it would have wound up in the hands of the pagans such as the Babylonians, they would have found it laughable or even incomprehensible. And so, this interpretation that I'm suggesting here relies on the understanding that God condescends to humanity. He lowers himself numerous times in scriptures, whether it's, taking on forms of human communication, i.e. he talks in words, or that times when he sends his only begotten Son to become a man and die on a cross for sinners like us. When I read passages like this that we've listed above, it says that passages that say that the world looks and is shaped very differently from the way I scientifically understand it today. I take comfort that this revelation was not directed to me, but to a people group who understood the world very differently, and in God's mercy, He communicated to them in a way that was meaningful and deliberate. He met them where they were culturally, and I would suggest that we should not mistake this as God is lying, or that He's misrepresenting reality. He is simply placing the burden of the message to be more important than communicating facts about science. And we will discuss this problem throughout the course, but for now, let's just give this problem a definition and a name. The name we'll use is called Pan-Babylonianism. And the definition we'll use is this, that Pan-Babylonianism is the assertion that the worldview and culture of the Mesopotamians greatly affected the people of the ancient Near East, including the ancient Israelites, and will saddle us with kind of a theological problem. Which came first, the Babylonians or the Bible? And the chronological answer is the Babylonians. And then a secondary question, why do I believe the Bible as a Christian more so than I often believe Babylonian texts? This will be a question that will just engulf our entire study throughout the course of this class. So now, while the Sumerians were the first people group to leave us written records of themselves in Mesopotamia, they were not the most successful people group. By 2350, a new people group had begun settling into Mesopotamia, and this was a Semitic people group known as the Acadians. And by Semitic, what I mean is they had a Semitic language, which was related to Hebrew, but was an older language. Now, interestingly, the Acadians will establish the first large empire in Mesopotamia, and they will assimilate much of Sumerian culture and religion. And this will be a pattern we'll see over and over again when it comes to Mesopotamia, that people groups will wander into Mesopotamia, they'll conquer the land, but the gods of the ancient Sumerians won't vanish. Instead, the new people group will begin worshiping these ancient Sumerian deities, and they'll begin using a lot of Sumerian cultural innovations, such as writing, cylinder seals, potter's wheels, and other such technology. And for our study, the primary Acadian person I would like you to know is a ruler named Sargon I, also known as Sargon the Great. Sargon will set the standard for Mesopotamian rulers, as he will be both a great military commander and a good government organizer. The empire of Sargon will stretch from the city of Haran all the way down to the Persian Gulf, and he will administer this vast, roughly 800-mile tract of territory by allowing the administrators of the cities he conquered to keep their old jobs. Now, this will prove to be a pretty shrewd move, that Sargon will be able to rule his empire indirectly using previous rulers working for him. And many Mesopotamian kings after him will follow this example. Now, the homeland of the Acadians is roughly the central portion areas in between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. The city of Mari will transition back and forth between the Acadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, as well as some smaller groups that will come in and out like the Gudians and the Kassites, and even the Amorites. So don't take this yellow shaded area as a hard and fast rule for where are the areas dominated by the Acadians, because later the same area will be dominated by the Babylonians. So go ahead and pause your video and shade these areas in yellow. And note that the Acadians and the Babylonians will control this area, all the way from Mari down to the city of Nippur. And in between that is the city of Babylon. And this area is, again, roughly in between the shaded areas of the Euphrates and the Tigris that you've already marked. So let's look at Sargon's empire. You see, under the rule of Sargon, the areas of northern and southern Mesopotamia will come under his control, and they'll call this the Acadian hegemony. And we will see this trend reoccur many times where a people group in Mesopotamia will rise to dominance and they'll conquer a large area of territory only to be supplanted by another people group living somewhere in Mesopotamia. And our general rule of thumb is going to be this, that people that are native to Mesopotamia will only be able to successfully conquer areas within the Fertile Crescent, while other groups that had to come from out of the area, such as the Hellenistic Syrians or the Persians who had to cross the Zagros Mountains, they will be better at conquering the mountain areas beyond these great rivers. And so for your quiz, you do not need to know this yellow shaded area, but you will need to know that the homeland of the Acadians is the area that's in between Mari and Nippur. Now, let's talk about the Acadians biblically for a second. You see, today, most scholars assume that Abraham, the father of the Israelite people, was ethnically an Acadian. By the time that Abraham is alive, somewhere between 2166 BC and 1991 BC, the Semitic Acadians were losing their influence in Samaria, and they were migrating back north to where their ancestral lands were. And this is in agreement with what we read earlier about Abraham and his family in Genesis 11:31 through 32. When the Sumerians regained control of Ur, and specifically under the rule of their king, Shulgi, many of the Acadians became displaced, and Terah, Abraham's father, was one of them, and he moved his family all the way north to Haran. And I would like to note that this state of affairs was not necessarily a bad thing, that God seems to have used this displacement in order to contact Abraham and to specifically make a covenant with this wandering Aramean, as Deuteronomy 26:5 calls him. So, other biblical scholars such as Bill Arnold and Brian Beyer also maintain that God is purposely using this event to distance Abraham from the polytheistic culture of the Acadians and the Sumerians. Specifically, God is moving Abraham to have him wander around in the deserts of the southern Levant, an area known as the Negev, and it is clear that God is doing so because he wants to move him far, far away from this Sumerian and Acadian culture and their gods. And I think it also shows that God is certainly capable of working miracles regardless of the situation, because Abraham will become a very prosperous and wealthy person, even though God has moved him away from civilization into the middle of nowhere. So let's talk archaeology for a second. One of the more common types of artifacts that can be found throughout the ancient Near East are these charming devices known as cylinder seals. Now, these seals can be made of wood, stone, or metal, and they were often worn as jewelry by running a chain or a cord through it and then wearing it around the neck. And as shown above, these cylinder seals have carvings in them so that if you rolled them over a piece of clay or dirt, it would make an impression in the clay. And in many ways, this cylinder seal and the engraving that it made could serve as a signature of sorts. And often official documents are sealed with these cylinder seal impressions. Now, in Genesis chapter 38, we actually see a cylinder seal become one of the major plot points of the narrative. In this account, Judah has a young daughter-in-law named Tamar, and Tamar's first and second husbands, who were both Judah's children, passed away. Now, according to the Levirate custom that we looked at in the marriage and family unit, Judah would have been forced to have his third son also marry Tamar because she didn't have any children. But Judah believed that Tamar is a rather unlucky woman, and he thought he would lose yet another son if he married him off to her. So Tamar, after realizing that Judah is never going to let him or let her marry his son, she decides to take justice into her own hands and settle the score her way. So she dresses up as a prostitute, and she propositioned Judah to have sex with her while wearing a veil so he couldn't tell who it was he was talking to. Now, Judah, when this proposition goes down, admits he's got no money on him at the moment. So Tamar accepts his cylinder seal as a lien against what he owes. He eventually promises to send her a small yearling sheep. But later, Judah will receive word that Tamar is pregnant, and he attempts to have her killed for adultery. Now, Tamar simply is going to send the cylinder seal over to Judah and says, the guy who got me pregnant is the person who owns this seal. Now Judah's going to look at this and going to go, oh, this is my fault. And he will even concede that Tamar has actually acted more righteously because he should have, according to his own cultural standards, given his third son to be Tamar's husband. But I want you to notice that in this way, cylinder seals were used to establish identity, much the same way that we would use a photo ID today. And they served as unique devices that were often only attached to a single owner. So, leaving the time of Genesis and moving a little bit further ahead, around 900 BC, a group known as the Assyrians will become one of the most dominant military powers in the Fertile Crescent. And this will be largely due to their innovations in siege warfare. Specifically, and also tied with that, their ability to conscript and train large numbers of soldiers at one time. Now, some of these military advances will be simple technology. For example, they'll learn how to produce iron weapons easily, and they'll learn to build things such as siege towers, which are large wooden structures that protected archers and infantrymen so that they could get close to a city wall and even climb over it. And we'll discuss Assyrian military tactics in a later lecture on weapons and warfare. But for the time being, it will suffice to note that the prophet Isaiah describes the Assyrians as the club or the hammer of God's wrath. And biblically speaking, God will use the Assyrians to conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. As pictured on the slide, the Assyrians are a rather brutal people group, and they have a nasty habit of making examples out of the people they conquered. And their empire is largely sustained on psychological warfare, that if a people group or a city rebels, they will suffer greatly when Assyria comes to basically kick butt and take names. And frequently, these Assyrians would deport people to other sections of their empire, and that this will certainly be the fate of the northern kingdom of Israel. In the year 722, the Assyrian king named Shalmaneser V will finish his siege of the capital city of Samaria. He will burn the city to the ground. He will place hooks in the noses of all of the Israelite captives he's taken, and he will lead them north, resettling them in a city called Halah, which is along the bank of the Habur River. Now, the homeland for the Assyrians is along the northern sections of the Tigris, and particularly it's right where the lower and upper Zab rivers merge with the Tigris. And this places the Assyrians into close contact with the northern tribal groups known as the Scythians and the eastern tribes known as the Medes. And many scholars will assume that the Assyrians gathered their rather nasty reputation because they basically had to rise to the challenge of these more barbaric peoples, and they still were able to come out on top, basically making them lean, mean fighting machines. Now, here on the banks of the two Zab rivers, two great Assyrian cities, one known as Nineveh here to the north, and then Ashur to the south, will be built. Now, later on, along the Euphrates, the Habur, and the Baalak rivers, the Assyrians will extend their influence, building up the cities of Carchemish, Haran, and even conquering Mari between the years of 900 BC and 612 BC. So go ahead and pause your video here and mark all of these cities as I've done here, and shade in the area that constitutes Assyria's traditional homeland. Now, when we talk about the Assyrian Empire, we need to talk about a king named Tiglath-Pileser III. He reigned between the years 745 BC and 727 BC. And the Assyrian Empire during this time just continued to grow and gobble up kingdoms left and right in the Levant. By 701 BC, one of Tiglath-Pileser's successors, a man known as Sennacherib, would invade the southern kingdom of Judah, because the northern kingdom had already been destroyed, and he will come very close to capturing the city of Jerusalem. We see this recorded in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 37, verses 1 through 38, we read that the king Hezekiah prayed to the Lord that the city of Jerusalem would be delivered from the king of Assyria. And the angel of the Lord will descend that evening and kill 185,000 Assyrian troops over the course of a single night. Now, while I admit that this is certainly an impressive miracle, it is also very notable to me that the Assyrians could lose 200,000 soldiers, and this did not cripple their empire. This tells me that the Assyrian army constituted a massive war machine, able to raise lots of expendable manpower in a way that is just really hard to fathom, even today. Now, interestingly for our study, Sennacherib also records his version of this major event of him trying to capture Jerusalem on his famous hexagonal prism. Now, in this document, Sennacherib brags that he had King Hezekiah caged up in Jerusalem like a bird. But what makes this account unique, however, is that Sennacherib never says that he won the battle. At least, he definitely doesn't brag about it in ways that he brags about other cities where he says, I captured it, I destroyed it, I took prisoners. And all that he can claim in this is that he had Hezekiah on the ropes, but he won't claim that he won. Now, as we move closer to modern times, we will begin to see more and more archaeological data, and sometimes that data will be from two sides of a war. And this is one of our first cases of this, where we have both the testimony of the Assyrians and the testimony of the Judeans in the Bible. And we will start to see that these accounts will conflict more and more. And the official records of pagan kings, I would just like to say for the record, were often used to support the king's reign. And they would very rarely admit when a king was defeated. And so it's notable to me here that while both the Bible and Sennacherib agree to an extent, i.e., that the Assyrians did start a siege, but something happened that caused them to retreat before they could conquer the city. Now, this question will become a driving theological issue that we will talk about through this study all throughout the semester. And the question I would like to raise is this. Why do I, as a Christian, trust the Bible as a historical source more than I trust some of these other sources, like Sennacherib's prism? Well, the answer to this is quite complicated, but let me just give you my first reason why I believe this. I believe that the Bible is more trustable because, unlike the accounts of pagan kings, which are largely pro-monarchy propaganda, the Bible does not hesitate to cast its kings and even the people of Israel themselves in a negative light. And at least for my satisfaction, this demonstrates that the Bible is often a more objective source than we see in a lot of these ancient documents. Now, the next important tribal group we need to discuss is this people known as the Chaldeans. This group took over the city of Babylon around 1800 BC, and they made it their headquarters for the next 1,000 years and longer. And this culture will rise and fall several times throughout the centuries, and in many ways they will become the most villainous group of people that we see recorded in the scriptures. For example, Babylon is the city where humans first tried to build their tower to reach the heavens. Later, the king of Babylon destroys the temple of God in 586 BC. And even later, even in the New Testament, the city of Babylon is often used as a metaphor for a spiritual harlot. And so, in short, the Babylonians in the Bible are the perennial bad guys. And so it is necessary for us to understand what makes these people unique that the Bible singled them out so frequently. And I think the first thing we should probably note is that the Babylonians had two major uprisings on the world stage. Their first attempt at a major empire started around 1800 BC, going to 1600 BC. And the major king of this era is this man known as King Hammurabi. Sometimes it's pronounced Hammurapi. But in either case, we're dealing with the founder of what is known as the Old Babylonian Kingdom. He will unite most of Mesopotamia under his banner, and he will specifically be known for establishing a large law code of 212 laws that many people use to compare against biblical laws and other laws of the ancient world. But it's the second empire that will come out of this Chaldean city, known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, that I really want to focus on. You see, under the leadership of a king known as Nabopolassar, the Babylonians systematically dismantled the Assyrian Empire. They will conquer the city of Ashur in 614 BC. They will conquer Nineveh in 612 BC. And they will defeat the remnant of the Assyrians along with most of the Egyptian army in a royal rumble around the city of Carchemish in 605 BC. And this victory will give the Babylonians complete control and access to the Levant, and the kingdom of Judah will begin to decline, especially after 605 BC, when Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar, comes to power. And by 586 BC, Babylon will destroy the city of Jerusalem, and they'll bring the line of Davidic kings to an end. And for our study, it is important that we should note that many prophetic books of the Bible are geared towards explaining how this happened. How did the Babylonians destroy God's city? How did the Babylonians destroy God's chosen kingly line? And I guess for the basic problem, how did the Babylonians defeat the Israelites and send them back into exile? Well, the prophetic conclusion to this question is going to be pretty simple. The prophets are all going to unanimously say that Israel has sinned, and God was handing them over to a foreign power, just as he promised in Deuteronomy 28:64. For example, the prophet Habakkuk will wrestle with God's decree that the Babylonians are going to conquer Judah, even though Habakkuk admits the Babylonians are more evil than the people from Judah. The Babylonians deserve punishment just as much, if not more. Another example, the prophet Nahum will predict the downfall of Nineveh, and specifically he will describe them falling to the Babylonians. One of the largest prophetic books around this time is the book of Jeremiah, and time and again, Jeremiah will urge the people to submit to Babylon and to submit to their rule unless they want to be destroyed. But of all the prophetic books that I want to discuss, the book of Daniel is probably the most important for the study of the Babylonians. You see, Daniel and his friends were taken captive in the year 605 BC when Nebuchadnezzar first came to power. In Babylon, they were trained for a life of public service to the king of Babylon. And as the text makes clear, so long as God was with Daniel and his friends, even the mighty Nebuchadnezzar was powerless to truly harm the people of God. In this way, the Jews lived under an interesting but paradoxical meta-narrative. They would be ruled over by foreign powers from basically the time of Babylon all the way until the time that the Messiah comes. And yet, those same world powers were put in place by God himself. And there was really nothing that a king or an army could do against the people of God unless God gave them permission. Now, this belief that the God of the Jews is in control over everything will make the Jewish people a rather unique people group in the ancient Near East. As your Walton textbook illustrates, many of the pagan gods of the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Assyrians often went to war with one another. At least the people believed they did. And the people also believed that if they were fighting against one another, that also must mean that their gods were fighting against one another. And they also believed, coincidentally, that when one of the gods gained an upper hand and defeated a rival god, then this simply meant that the people who worshipped the victorious god would also conquer and enslave the people of the defeated god. But the book of Daniel and many of the other prophetic books from this era will challenge this notion. The Jews were certainly defeated by the Babylonians, but even as their servants, the God of the Jews would powerfully demonstrate his control over the rise and fall of the nations. And this is why predictive prophecy is going to become my second reason for why I say I believe the Bible is a more reliable witness than many of these pagan documents. You see, unlike the pagans, which required omens to interpret the theological meaning of an event after it happened, the witness of the Israelite prophets is that God can foretell or predict the future with 100% accuracy, even a prediction that happens centuries before the time that it is fulfilled. And this, I might add, is often why skeptics are so inclined to attribute very late dates to prophetic books and texts, because the claim that God is in control of the universe, that he can predict the rise and fall of a nation, is a very formidable statement of belief, if it's true, and I believe it is. And it is also very, very different from the types of prophecy we see in the ancient Near East, which often go from the results rather than predicting anything per se. Now, the next set of people that we're going to look at are often described in the biblical text together, the Medes and the Persians. Now, these people groups lived to the east of the Zagros Mountains, and it was not until they were unified under a man named Cyrus the Great in 550 BC that they began to develop an empire of their own. Now, we don't need to say much about this group now, because we will discuss them in depth in later lectures, so we don't need to go into as great of detail here. So go ahead and pause your video here and shade in the homeland of the Medes and the Persians, and also make sure to label the cities of Susa and Persepolis, as these are the major administrative centers of the Persian Empire. Oh yeah, and speaking of the Persian Empire, I don't think I can stress this enough, that this empire was enormous. It will stretch as far south as Egypt, as far west as the peninsula of Greece, and as far east as the Indus River, today the border of India. And the rise of this empire will allow the Jews to have a certain amount of freedom to travel back to Jerusalem, away from Babylon, and they'll be permitted to rebuild their temple. This will be a process that will last from roughly 539 BC to 516 BC. And the Persian Empire itself will last from 539 BC all the way to 330 BC. So go ahead and keep that in mind as well, that the books of the Old Testament, the final books of the Old Testament, Malachi, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, all of these books will be written when the Persian Empire is in charge, and they will end, the entire New Testament itself will end while Persia is still in control. Now, another people group that we will need to discuss today is a group known as the Syrians. Now, we've already looked at the Syrians a little bit when we discussed the account of Naaman the Syrian and his healing from his problem with leprosy last week. But of all the contributions of the Syrians, we cannot undervalue this one when it comes to the study of the Bible, and that is that the Syrians will develop a language known as Aramaic. And this Aramaic language will become probably one of the most important trade languages during the latter era of the Old Testament and all the way until New Testament times. You see, during the times of the Neo-Babylonians and the Persian Empire, all of these people groups are now being forced under one collective government. And there was a need for a single language to basically unite the empire. And both the Babylonians and the Persians will use Aramaic to become the standard trade language for their massive empires. So go ahead and pause the video here and mark the homeland of the Syrians, and note that Damascus was the capital city during the Old Testament era. But by the time of the New Testament, they will have a new capital city, a city called Antioch. And this city will actually be so large, it'll be the third largest city in the world by the time Paul is preaching there. And this will bring us to the last major Mesopotamian empire we need to study today. With the rise of Alexander the Great and the Greeks, the Persian Empire fell in 330 BC. However, Alexander died pretty young at the ripe old age of 33, and his generals fought for control of the remnants of his empire for decades. Now, arguably, the largest Greek empire that will be carved out of Alexander's empire, it was known as the Seleucid Empire. And it gets its name because the Greek general who founded it was named Seleucus. And he will also found a major city known as Antioch, and he will name it after his son, Antiochus. And this is important to note because this entire empire will rise and fall during what is known as the intertestamental period. And it will be significant in affecting how the Jewish people saw Greek culture, and specifically that they tended to come up with a very negative view of the Greeks, of Greek literature, of Greek government, and this dislike will spill over onto the Romans, who will replace the Greek Empire after 63 BC. Now, like the Persians, the rise and fall of this empire is way too complex to discuss in this lecture, and so we'll be giving it much greater detail on the 7th week of class. So for now, just kind of note this, that this will be the last major Mesopotamian-bound empire that we'll see for our study. Okay, so you still with me? We got one more people group to go. Let's conclude this lecture by discussing a group known as the Arabians. Now, unlike the other people groups that we've studied, who managed to carve out rather large empires during the Old Testament era, the Arabians will not manage to unify and build an empire until the 7th century AD. And they'll do so because they're united by a religion known as Islam. But the Arabians are important because, like the Israelites, they have a biological connection with Abraham. One of Abraham's concubines named Hagar will produce his first son, a son named Ishmael. But when Isaac was born to Abraham's wife, Sarah, Abraham will send his son and his concubine away, and they will travel south and eventually settle along the coast of what would be modern-day Saudi Arabia. Now, the Arabians will not play a huge role in the text of the Old or the New Testament. They'll show up periodically, but they will show up frequently enough that we need to know where they're from and why they're important. So go ahead and pause this video one last time here, and we'll mark the homeland of the Arabians. Sometimes they're known as the Ishmaelites in the text of Genesis. Okay, so you got all that. Let's see how well we did. Your finished map of Mesopotamia should look something like this, with the homelands of the Arabs, the Syrians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Medes, and the Persians all marked. And just simply put, if it shows up on this map, it could be a question on this week's quiz. So make sure that you have all the major rivers, mountain chains, and cities labeled as well. And finally, you'll want to make sure that you study some of the conceptual ideas from this lecture. For example, you want to know that the three-tiered cosmos of the ancient Near Eastern worldview and why it was important to the study of Israelite cosmology. You also want to know things like the importance of cylinder seals. You'll want to note the role that the Assyrians and the Babylonians played in the rise and fall of the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. And finally, make sure that you understand the two theological assertions we've made during this lecture concerning why the Bible is a reliable historical resource when compared to ancient Near Eastern documents. That, one, I've said that the Bible does not shy away from showing the faults of its own people. The kings and the people of Israel are often portrayed in a negative light, and this shows a type of objectivity that we just do not see in other ancient Near Eastern texts. But secondly, also, that the standard for Hebrew prophets is radically different from the prophets of the ancient world. The prophets of the ancient world tended to look at events and try to determine what had the gods already done, whereas Hebrew prophets tended to rely on God to reveal the future to them before it ever happened. Now, the Bible makes some pretty radical claims that God is in control over all history, even when the people of Israel are losing militarily and politically. And this is going to be a confusing and often paradoxical point of view to anyone else in the ancient world. So, this will conclude our lecture on Mesopotamia. God bless you all, my friends, and I pray that you have a wonderful day. We'll see you again soon for our next lecture.